They said she was spoiled. They said she was the daughter of a liar and a thief. In the brutal social circles of 1890s New York, reputation is the only currency that matters. And Evelyn Sterling was bankrupt. She stood in the pouring rain, watching her family home being auctioned off, while the man who framed her father stood smiling in the front row. She thought her life was over. She didn't know that the dark, brooding stranger watching from the shadows was about to buy her a future. But was he her savior, or a more dangerous captor? This is the story of a marriage built on a lie, and the public kiss that exposed the shocking truth. The auctioneer's gavel sounded less like a tool of commerce and more like the crack of a pistol execution. Sold to Mr. Silas Vane, the Sterling estate, including all contents, for the sum of $4,000. A ripple of hushed whispers moved through the crowd gathered in the drawing room of number 42 Fifth Avenue. It was a cold, grey Tuesday in November 1893. Outside, the rain battered the windows, weeping for the tragedy unfolding inside. Evelyn Sterling stood in the corner, her back pressed against the velvet wallpaper that was no longer hers. She wore a black morning dress, the silk slightly frayed at the cuffs, a detail the hawk-eyed society matrons had already noted and gossiped about. Just 2 weeks ago, this room had been filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of crystal. Now it smelled of wet wool and betrayal. 4,000, a woman whispered near the door. For the entire estate? It's robbery. It's justice, a man replied with a sneer. After what her father did, stealing from the railway pension fund, the old man took the coward's way out with that pistol, left his daughter to clean up the mess. She's lucky she isn't in a workhouse. Evelyn bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the metallic tang of blood. She refused to cry. She was 22 years old, possessing the kind of porcelain beauty that usually inspired poetry. But today, her face was a mask of stone. Her father, Arthur Sterling, had been the most respected banker in New York. Then came the accusation, the sudden evidence found in his safe, and his body found in the study before he could defend himself. She knew he was innocent. But in New York society, the truth didn't matter. Only the perception of it did. The crowd began to disperse, clutching their newly purchased trinkets, her mother's silver tea set, her father's pocket watch. As the room cleared, one man remained. Silas Vane. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved from soft dough, pale and sweating even in the chill of the unheated house. He adjusted his silk cravat and walked toward Evelyn, a predatory smile stretching his thin lips. He had been her father's junior partner, the man who had discovered the missing funds. "Evelyn," Silas said, his voice oily with false sympathy. Or should I say, Miss Sterling, though I suppose that name doesn't carry much weight anymore. "Mr. Vane," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You have your house. You have the furniture. I ask that you allow me to retrieve my personal trunk and leave." Silas chuckled, stepping uncomfortably close. He smelled of cigars and stale brandy. "Where will you go? The boarding houses won't take you. Your aunt in Boston has already sent a telegram disowning you. I saw it on the hall table." Evelyn felt a cold pit open in her stomach. She hadn't read the telegram yet, but she knew he was telling the truth. "That is none of your concern." "But it is," Silas crooned, reaching out to touch a lock of her auburn hair. Evelyn flinched away, backing into the wall. "I am a charitable man, Evelyn. I know your father was troubled. But you? You have assets." His eyes raked over her figure. "I am willing to let you stay here, in this house, as the mistress of the estate." The implication hung in the air, gross and heavy. He wasn't offering marriage. He was offering her a position as a kept woman in her own childhood home. "I would rather freeze on the streets," Evelyn hissed, her green eyes flashing with a dangerous fire. Silas's face hardened. The mask of civility dropped. "Then freeze you shall. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises, Miss Sterling. If you are not gone, I will have the constables drag you out as a vagrant." He turned on his heel and marched out, barking orders at the movers to begin stripping the paintings from the walls. Evelyn stood alone in the empty, echoing room. The despair she had been holding back finally crashed over her. She had $11 in her purse. She had no family, no friends, and a surname that was synonymous with criminal. She walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked cobblestones of Fifth Avenue. A black carriage was parked across the street. It had been there for hours, the horses stomping impatiently in the mud. The curtains of the carriage were drawn, but Evelyn felt a strange sensation, the prickling feeling of being watched. She didn't know it then, but the man inside that carriage had just bought her father's debt, and he was about to come to collect. Evelyn dragged her heavy trunk down the limestone steps of the mansion. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her forehead. She wrestled the trunk onto the sidewalk, her boots sinking into a puddle of icy slush. Passers-by, people who had dined at her table a month ago, diverted their eyes, stepping into the street to avoid walking near her. "Need a hand with that, miss?" A rough voice called out. A carriage driver. Not the one from the black carriage across the street, but a passing hackney. I have no money for a fare," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. The driver shrugged and whipped his horses, moving on. Evelyn sat on her trunk, the water seeping through her dress. She was shivering violently. This was it, the end of the line. Suddenly, the door of the black carriage across the street opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a long charcoal overcoat and a top hat pulled low. He didn't run through the rain. He walked with a deliberate, terrifying calmness, ignoring the storm as if it were beneath his notice. He stopped in front of her. He held a black umbrella, which he tilted slightly to shield her, leaving himself exposed to the downpour. Evelyn looked up. The man was striking, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes the color of stormy steel. He looked dangerous. He looked like a man who built empires and burned them down for sport. "Miss Sterling," he said. His voice was a low baritone, commanding and devoid of the pity she had seen in others. "If you are a reporter," Evelyn said through chattering teeth, "I have nothing to say." "I am not a reporter. My name is Julian Thorne." Evelyn froze. The name was infamous. Julian Thorne, the Iron Baron. He was a railway tycoon from Chicago who had recently moved to New York. The rumors about him were endless, that he had killed a man in a duel in New Orleans, that he won his first railroad in a poker game, that he was richer than the Vanderbilts, but banned from every respectable club in the city because of his new money and ruthless tactics. "Mr. Thorne," Evelyn said, rising slowly, "I have nothing you want. Mr. Vane has taken everything." "Vane took the furniture," Julian said, glancing dismissively at the mansion behind her. "He didn't take the only thing of value left in this family." "And what is that?" "Your bloodline." Evelyn stared at him, confused. "My name is Mudd, Mr. Thorne. My father died a disgraced man." "Your father was a fool, but his name goes back 300 years to the founding of this city," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers. "My money is new. It smells of coal and steel, the high society of New York, the Astors, the Livingstons. They won't let me build my new terminal in the city center. They block me at every turn because they don't like who I am. They don't respect me." He took a step closer. The heat radiating from him was palpable in the freezing air. "I need a wife, Miss Sterling. A wife with an old name. A wife who knows the etiquette, the lineage, the secrets of these people. If I marry a Sterling, even a disgraced one, they have to open the door to me. It is the rule of their own absurd game." Evelyn laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You want to marry me? I am a pariah. Marrying me won't get you into society. It will get you laughed out of it." "Let me worry about that," Julian said softly. "I have a plan. But I need a partner who has nothing left to lose. A partner who hates Silas Vane as much as I do." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What do you know about Silas Vane?" "I know he didn't buy this house with his own money," Julian said darkly. "And I know your father didn't shoot himself." The world seemed to stop spinning. The rain, the cold, the noise of the street, it all faded. "What did you say?" she whispered. "Marry me, Evelyn," Julian said, extending a gloved hand. "Marry me and I will give you a home. I will give you protection, and I will give you the resources to destroy the men who ruined your family. It will be a marriage of convenience. I get my entry into society. You get your revenge." Evelyn looked at his hand. It was large, strong, and steady. She looked back at the house Silas Vane now owned. She thought of her father, lying in the casket with a bullet wound the coroner said was self-inflicted, but which she had never believed. She was alone. She was freezing. She was powerless. Until now. Evelyn reached out and took Julian Thorne's hand. "I don't want love, Mr. Thorne." "Good," Julian said, his fingers closing around hers with possessive strength. "Because I have none to give. But I promise you this, Evelyn. Anyone who insults you from this day forward answers to me." The wedding was a sterile affair, held 3 days later in the private chapel of Julian's massive estate on the outskirts of the city. There were no guests, only the priest, who looked terrified of Julian, and 2 witnesses, Julian's silent bodyguard, a giant of a man named Marcus, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins. Evelyn wore a dress of pale blue silk that Julian had delivered to her hotel room. It fit perfectly, which unsettled her. How had he known her measurements? "I do," Evelyn said, her voice echoing in the empty stone chamber. "I do," Julian replied. He didn't look at the priest. He looked at her. His gaze was intense, analyzing her, as if checking for cracks in a newly purchased weapon. When he kissed her to seal the vows, it was brief and cold. His lips were firm, but there was no softness in them. It was a stamp of ownership, nothing more. The drive back to his city mansion, a towering Gothic structure on Madison Avenue that the neighbors called the Fortress, was silent. When they arrived, Julian led her into the grand foyer. It was magnificent, filled with expensive art and marble statues, but it felt like a museum, not a home. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," Julian said, removing his gloves. "My rooms are in the West. We will dine together, when my schedule permits. You have an unlimited allowance for clothes and household needs. Marcus will accompany you whenever you leave the house." "Am I a prisoner, Julian?" Evelyn asked, using his first name for the first time. It felt strange on her tongue. Julian turned to look at her. The gaslight flickered, casting long shadows across his face. "You are a target, Evelyn. Silas Vane knows I paid off your father's remaining debts to clear the Sterling name. He knows we are married. He is displeased. Why does he care? Because Vane needs the railway contracts that I now control through this marriage," Julian revealed. He thought if he destroyed your father, he could swoop in and buy the rights cheap. He didn't count on me." Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. "So I am just a chess piece." "We are both chess pieces, Evelyn. The difference is, I intend to be the player moving them." He paused, his expression softening imperceptibly. "Rest. Tomorrow we begin. We have been invited to the opera. It will be our first public appearance." "They will shred us apart," Evelyn warned. "Let them try." The next evening, the Metropolitan Opera House was buzzing with the energy of 1,000 whispered scandals. When Evelyn and Julian appeared in the private box, the music from the orchestra pit seemed to falter. Every opera glass in the house turned toward them. Evelyn held her head high, gripping the velvet railing. She could see them pointing. The whispers drifted up like smoke. Then, the door to the box opposite theirs opened. Silas Vane entered, accompanied by a woman Evelyn recognized, Clara Belmont, a gossip columnist for the New York Chronicle, and Evelyn's former best friend. Silas looked across the expanse of the theatre. He saw Evelyn. He saw the diamonds around her neck, diamonds Julian had placed there an hour ago. Silas's face turned a violent shade of red. He raised a glass of champagne in a mocking toast, then deliberately turned his back on her. "Steady." Julian's voice came from right beside her ear. He wasn't touching her, but his presence was a shield. "Don't look at him. Look at the stage." "He has Clara with him," Evelyn whispered. "Tomorrow's papers will be vicious." "Let them write," Julian said. "I own the printing press that makes the paper they write on." Evelyn looked at her husband. For the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. She saw anger, fierce, protective anger. "Why are you doing this, Julian? Really?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He stared at Silas Vane across the theatre. "Because, Evelyn, 5 years ago, your father saved my life, and I was too late to save his." The curtain rose, but the real drama was in the audience, and the war had just begun. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought the New York Chronicle. Evelyn sat in the breakfast parlor, the newspaper spread out before her on the mahogany table. Her hands shook as she read the headline, bold and damning. "The Baron and the Beggar, a union of greed and desperation." Clara Belmont had not held back. The article described Evelyn as a penniless opportunist who had sold her family's last shred of dignity to a ruthless industrialist. It hinted that Julian was investigating the sterling accounts not to clear them, but to hide his own complicity in her father's downfall. "Do not read that trash!" Julian's voice cut through the silence. He stood in the doorway, dressed in a sharp tweed suit, looking as if he hadn't slept. He walked over and snatched the paper from the table, crumpling it in one large fist before tossing it into the fireplace. "She calls me a whore in everything but name, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice hollow. "And she accuses you of destroying my father." "Clara Belmont is a mouthpiece for Silas Vane," Julian said, pouring himself a black coffee. "Vane is scared. He saw us last night. He saw that you were not broken. Now he is trying to break you through public opinion." "It's working," Evelyn whispered. "Mrs. Astor sent a note returning our donation to the Orphans Fund. We are pariahs." Julian set his cup down with a sharp clink. "Come with me." He led her not to the drawing room, but down a corridor she hadn't explored, to the heavy oak door of his private study. He unlocked it with a key from his vest pocket. Inside, the room was a chaotic contrast to the rest of the pristine house. Maps of the railway lines covered the walls. Stacks of ledgers were piled high. But on the far wall, pinned to a corkboard, were documents that made Evelyn gasp. There were diagrams of her father's bank, timetables of guard rotations, and a piece of paper she recognized instantly, her father's suicide note. "You have the note," Evelyn said, stepping closer, her heart pounding. "The police took this." "I bought it from the coroner," Julian admitted. "Look closely at the ink, Evelyn." She squinted. The handwriting was her father's, looping and elegant, but near the bottom, where the signature lay, the ink seemed slightly different, a shade darker. "The top part," Julian explained, standing close behind her, "was a draft of a resignation letter he wrote 3 years ago when he was ill. Vane stole it from the archives. He cut off the bottom and forged the last line and the signature." "Forged?" Evelyn spun around to face him. "How do you know?" "Because Arthur Sterling was left-handed," Julian said intensely. "Look at the smear on the signature. It smudges to the right. Only a right-handed man drags his hand across the wet ink like that. Silas Vane is right-handed." Evelyn felt the room tilt. "You have proof he was murdered." "I have suspicion. Not proof. Not enough to hang Vane, and certainly not enough to get the Sterling estate back," Julian said, his jaw tightening. "Vane destroyed the bank's transaction logs. He burned the evidence of the embezzlement the night your father died. Without those logs, we can't prove Arthur didn't steal the money." "So we are helpless," Evelyn said, bitterness rising. "No!" Julian's eyes gleamed with a predatory light. "Vane thinks he burned them all. But your father was a meticulous man. He kept a duplicate set of records, a shadow ledger." "Where?" "I don't know," Julian admitted, "but I know who might. There is a man named Thomas O'Malley. He was your father's chief clerk. Vane fired him the day after the funeral. O'Malley has gone into hiding in the 5 Points. If we find him, we find the ledger." "I'm coming with you," Evelyn declared. "Absolutely not. 5 Points is a den of thieves and murderers. It is no place for a lady." "I am not a lady any more, Julian," Evelyn cried out, her composure finally cracking. "I am the wife of the Iron Baron. I am the daughter of a thief. I have nothing left to protect but the truth. If you go, I go." Julian looked at her for a long moment. He saw the steel in her spine, the same steel that had built his railroads. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first she had ever seen. "Very well, Mrs. Thorne," he said softly. "But change your dress. Put on something inconspicuous. We are going into the belly of the beast." The carriage ride to 5 Points was a descent into hell. The gas lamps grew fewer, the streets muddier, and the faces watching from the alleyways more desperate. They left the carriage blocks away to avoid drawing attention. Julian wore a rough worker's coat and a flat cap. Evelyn was dressed in a simple grey wool dress, a shawl wrapped tight around her head to hide her auburn hair and diamond earrings, which she had wisely left at home. Marcus, the giant bodyguard, walked 10 paces behind them, a silent sentinel. They found O'Malley in a dilapidated tenement on Mulberry Street. The room smelled of gin and boiled cabbage. O'Malley was a shadow of the man Evelyn remembered, gaunt, unshaven, shivering by a meagre fire. When he saw Evelyn, he wept. "Miss Evelyn, I told them I knew nothing," he sobbed. "Vane, he has men. They threatened my wife, my children." "Mr. Vane cannot hurt you now," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. He placed a heavy bag of gold coins on the rickety table. "This is enough to move your family west, to California. But I need the truth, Thomas. Where is the shadow ledger?" O'Malley looked at the gold, then at Evelyn's pleading eyes. "He didn't keep it at the bank," O'Malley whispered. "He knew Vane was watching. He hid it. He hid it in the one place Vane would never look." The cornerstone. The cornerstone? Evelyn asked. The Sterling Library, O'Malley rasped. The public library your father built, on 42nd Street. In the dedication stone, there is a hollow cavity behind the plaque. He put the book there the night he died. Thank you, Thomas, Evelyn said, tears in her eyes. Go, O'Malley urged, terrified. Vane has spies everywhere, even here. As if on cue, the window shattered. A Molotov cocktail crashed into the room, exploding in a ball of kerosene and fire. Down! Julian roared. He tackled Evelyn, shielding her body with his own as the flames licked the ceiling. Marcus kicked the door open. Boss, we got company. 3 men with clubs and knives were rushing up the narrow stairwell. They were Vane's street toughs, the Dead Rabbits gang, hired muscle. Julian pulled Evelyn to her feet. Marcus, clear the way! The giant roared and charged the stairwell. The sound of breaking bones and shouting filled the narrow hall. Julian didn't wait. He grabbed Evelyn's hand and dragged her toward the fire escape. They scrambled down the rusted iron ladder into the alleyway below. The rain had started again, mixing with the smoke. They hit the wet cobblestones running. This way, Julian commanded, pulling her through a maze of hanging laundry lines. A knife whistled past Julian's ear, embedding itself in a wooden crate. A 4th attacker emerged from the shadows, lunging at Evelyn. Without thinking, Evelyn swung the heavy reticule bag she carried, filled with the revolver Julian had insisted she take, and smashed it into the man's face. He staggered back, stunned. Julian finished him with a brutal right hook that laid the man out cold in the mud. He spun around, grabbing Evelyn by the shoulders, his eyes wild with adrenaline and terror. Are you hurt? I hit him, Evelyn stammered, looking at her hands. I hit him. You did, Julian breathed, pulling her against his chest. His heart was hammering against hers. For a moment, amidst the filth and the danger, the barrier between them shattered. He wasn't the Baron, and she wasn't the socialite. They were survivors. He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the soot on her cheek. The intensity of his gaze made her knees weak. He looked as if he wanted to devour her, to kiss the breath from her lungs. We have to go, he whispered hoarsely, pulling away before he lost control. Vane knows we are on to him. He knows we know about the ledger. He will try to destroy the library, Evelyn realized, horror dawning. No, Julian said, helping her into the carriage that Marcus had just pulled around the corner. He won't destroy it. He will wait for us to retrieve it. He wants to catch us in the act. He wants to frame us for theft. Then what do we do? Julian's face hardened into the mask of the Iron Baron. We give him a show. The Vanderbilt charity ball is in 2 days. Everyone will be there. Vane, the press, the police commissioner. We will retrieve the ledger, Evelyn. But we will do it right under his nose, while he is busy watching us dance. The Vanderbilt ball was the apex of the New York social season. Held in the grand ballroom of the Breakers' mansion, it was a sea of silk, pearls, and hypocrisy. Evelyn and Julian arrived late. It was a calculated move. Evelyn wore a gown of deep emerald green velvet, the color of envy and money. It was cut scandalously low in the back, draping her figure like liquid courage. Around her neck sat the sterling star, a massive diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, which Julian had tracked down and repurchased from a pawn shop in London just for this night. When the usher announced, Mr. and Mrs. Julian Thorne, the room went silent. They descended the grand staircase. Evelyn felt the weight of 300 stairs. She saw the sneers, the behind-the-hand whispers. But this time she didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, her arm linked through Julian's. Julian looked magnificent in his white tie and tails, but his eyes were scanning the room, counting the exits, locating the guards. Vane is here. Julian murmured, keeping a fake smile plastered on his face. By the champagne fountain. He's watching us. Silas Vane looked smug. He was holding court with the police commissioner and Clara Belmont. He believed he had won. He believed Julian and Evelyn were cowed, showing up only to beg for social scraps. "Are you ready?" Julian asked softly. "For the dance or the heist?" Evelyn replied, her nerves vibrating like a violin string. "Both." The orchestra began a waltz. Julian swept her onto the floor. They moved with a fluidity that surprised them both. Despite the marriage being a sham, their bodies knew each other. Julian's hand was hot on the small of her back. Evelyn's fingers gripped his shoulder tight. "Marcus is at the library now," Julian whispered as they spun. "He is retrieving the ledger." "You said Vane would be watching the library," Evelyn hissed. "He is. He has men there waiting to ambush us," Julian said calmly. "But they are looking for a man and a woman. They are not looking for a demolition crew." "Demolition crew?" Evelyn missed a step. "I bought the building next to the library this morning," Julian smirked. "Marcus isn't going through the front door. He's going through the wall." Evelyn looked at her husband with a mixture of shock and awe. "You are insane." "I am in love," Julian corrected himself before he could stop. He froze. Evelyn froze. They were in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by hundreds of people, but the world narrowed down to just them. "What did you say?" Evelyn breathed. Julian's eyes searched hers. The vulnerability was there, raw and open. "I said, I am invested in this outcome." He pulled away, masking the slip. "Keep dancing. We need to keep Vane's eyes on us for another 10 minutes. But the moment was broken by a commotion at the entrance. A group of uniformed police officers marched into the ballroom, led by a detective Evelyn recognized. Detective O'Connell, a man known to be on Vane's payroll. The music stopped. The crowd parted. Silas Vane stepped forward, his smile stretching into a wolfish grin. "Commissioner, excellent timing." Detective O'Connell marched up to Julian and Evelyn. "Julian Thorne, you are under arrest." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. "On what charge?" Julian asked, his voice ice-cold. "For the murder of Arthur Sterling," Vane announced loudly, playing to the crowd. "And for the attempted arson of the Sterling Library this evening. My men caught your associate, Marcus, trying to break in with explosives. He has confessed everything." Evelyn's heart stopped. Marcus had been caught? "It's a lie!" Evelyn shouted, stepping in front of Julian. "Is it?" Vane sneered. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "We have a witness who places Mr. Thorne at the Sterling house the night of the murder. A maid who saw him arguing with your father, Evelyn. Saw him holding the gun." The crowd murmured. It was the perfect trap. Vane had anticipated the break-in. He had set Marcus up. And now he had twisted the timeline to frame Julian. "Take him away," the commissioner ordered. Two officers grabbed Julian's arms. He didn't struggle. He looked at Evelyn. His eyes were urgent, communicating a silent message. "I will not leave my wife," Julian snarled, shaking the officers off for a second to face Evelyn. "You won't have a wife for long," Vane laughed. "Once the annulment goes through and you hang, Evelyn will be looking for a new protector. Perhaps I will be generous enough to take her back." The insult hung in the air, gross and slimy. Evelyn looked at the man she had married, the villain who had protected her, the cold man who had jumped in front of a bomb for her, the man who had almost said he loved her. Then she looked at Vane, the respectable man who had destroyed her life. Something inside Evelyn Sterling finally snapped, not into pieces, but into place. She reached into her emerald clutch. She didn't pull out a handkerchief. She pulled out the revolver she had used in 5 points. Screams erupted in the ballroom. Ladies fainted. Men dove for cover. Evelyn leveled the gun, not at the police, but straight at Silas Vane's heart. "Let him go," Evelyn commanded. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out like a bell, clear and terrifying. "Evelyn, put the gun down," Julian said, his voice calm, though his eyes were wide. "This isn't the way. He killed my father," Evelyn screamed, the tears finally falling. "He stole our home, and I will not let him take my husband." "She's hysterical," Vane shrieked, hiding behind the detective. "Arrest her too! Wait!" A booming voice echoed from the grand entrance. Everyone turned. Standing at the top of the stairs, battered, bloody, and covered in brick dust, was Marcus, and in his hands he held a thick, leather-bound book. "I didn't confess to anything," Marcus growled, limping down the stairs. "And I didn't need explosives to find this." He held the ledger up. "The shadow ledger. It's all here. The dates, the amounts, and the signatures." Vane's face went white. He lunged for Marcus, pulling a small pistol from his own coat. "No!" Julian shouted. He broke free from the stunned officers and tackled Vane. The two men crashed into the champagne tower. Glass shattered everywhere. Vane's gun skid across the floor. Julian, fueled by months of rage, pinned Vane to the ground, his fist raised. "Don't do it, Julian," Evelyn cried out, lowering her gun. "He isn't worth it. Let the law take him." Julian froze, his fist hovering over Vane's bloodied face. He looked up at Evelyn. She was standing amidst the wreckage of the ball, a gun in her hand, her reputation in tatters, looking like a warrior queen. He slowly lowered his hand. He stood up, straightening his jacket. He reached down, picked up the ledger Marcus had dropped, and handed it to the police commissioner. "Read page 42, Julian said breathlessly. "It details the transfer of pension funds to a private account under the name Silas Vane, dated 2 days before Arthur Sterling died." The commissioner, looking pale and realizing the tide had turned, opened the book. He read it. He looked at Vane, who was trying to crawl away. "Silas Vane," the commissioner said, his voice shaking. "You are under arrest for embezzlement and suspicion of murder." As the officers hauled a screaming Vane away, the room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. The elite of New York stared at the couple standing in the center of the ruins. Evelyn, with the gun still in her hand. Julian, bleeding from the lip. They were a scandal. They were a disaster. And they were about to do the one thing that would cement their legend. The silence in the ballroom was heavier than the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The orchestra had long since stopped playing. The air smelled of gunpowder, spilled champagne, and the sweat of fear. Silas Vane was gone, dragged out in irons, screaming obscenities that echoed down the marble hall. But the drama was not over. The audience, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the gatekeepers of New York society, remained fixed in place. They stared at Evelyn Sterling, the woman they had shunned, the woman who had just pulled a revolver from an evening bag and held a tyrant at gunpoint. Evelyn stood trembling amidst the shattered glass. The adrenaline that had fueled her was draining away, leaving her cold and exposed. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking violently. The revolver felt like a lead weight. She felt the old shame creeping back in. She had made a scene. She had acted like a mad woman, just as Vane had claimed. She saw Mrs. Astor whisper something behind her fan, her eyes wide with judgment. Evelyn prepared herself for the inevitable rejection. She would be arrested, or institutionalized, or simply cast out forever. "Give me the gun, Evelyn." Julian's voice was soft, a stark contrast to the violence of the last few minutes. He stepped in front of her, blocking the crowd's view of her trembling hands. He didn't snatch the weapon. He gently pried her fingers loose, one by one, taking the gun and slipping it into his own coat pocket. I ruined it," Evelyn whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I ruined everything. You needed their respect, Julian, and I gave them a scandal." Julian looked at her. His lip was split and bleeding, staining his white collar red. His hair was disheveled, but his eyes were clear, burning with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into grey. "You gave them the truth," Julian said firmly. He turned, facing the crowd. He did not wipe the blood from his mouth. He wore it like a badge of honor. He took Evelyn's hand, the hand that had held the gun, and raised it high in the air. "Listen to me!" Julian's voice boomed, filling the cavernous hall. "For months you have whispered. You have judged. You have called my wife the daughter of a thief. You have called me a robber baron." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "Tonight you saw the truth," Julian continued, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Arthur Sterling was an innocent man. He was murdered by the very man you welcomed into your clubs and your homes. Silas Vane was the thief. And this woman—" He squeezed Evelyn's hand tighter. "This woman is not a beggar. She is not a charity case. She is the bravest soul in this city." He looked at Evelyn, and his expression softened, the mask of the Iron Baron completely dissolving for the first time in his life. "I married Evelyn Sterling for a name," Julian confessed to the room, stripping away his own pride. "I thought I was buying a ticket into your world. But I was wrong. I was the one who was unworthy. She saved my life tonight. She saved her father's honor. And she has saved my soul from the darkness I have lived in for too long." A gasp went through the room. Men like Julian Thorne didn't talk about souls. They talked about stocks and steel. Julian turned to Evelyn, ignoring the hundreds of watching eyes. "They say ours is a marriage of convenience, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp that only she and those closest could hear. "They say it is a sham, a business deal." "Julian," Evelyn breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I am tired of lies," he said. "I want them to know. I want you to know." He reached out, cupping her face with his large, warm hands. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about the etiquette. "I love you, Evelyn," he said, the words ringing out with absolute certainty. "I don't want the railway contracts. I don't want the society invitations. I only want you. Today, tomorrow, and until the last train stops running." Evelyn let out a sob, a sound of pure release. "And I love you, Julian. My husband. My hero." Julian lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't the cold, chaste peck from their wedding day. It was a kiss of fire and desperation, a kiss that tasted of blood and victory. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her waist as if he intended to weld their bodies together. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, someone started to clap. It was the police commissioner. Then, Clara Belmont, seemingly shamed by the truth, or perhaps just sensing the wind changing, began to clap. Then the sound grew. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. It wasn't polite applause, it was a thunderous ovation. In that public kiss, the scandal was washed away. The beggar and the baron were gone. In their place stood Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, the most formidable, dangerous, and deeply in love couple in New York. Julian broke the kiss, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. "Let's go home, Mrs. Thorne." "Yes," Evelyn smiled, wiping a smudge of his blood from her own lip. "Let's go home." The carriage door clicked shut, sealing them away from the chaos of Fifth Avenue. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones began, a steady heartbeat against the silence of the night. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, the air was thick with the scent of rain, cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Julian slumped back against the seat, the adrenaline finally draining from his system. For the first time all night, the Iron Baron looked mortal. His white tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and a bruise was beginning to darken the sharp line of his jaw where he had struck the floor. He didn't look at Evelyn immediately. He stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the gaslights of the city blur into streaks of gold. Evelyn sat opposite him, her hands resting in her lap. They were no longer trembling. She looked at the man across from her, the man who had bought her like a piece of furniture, the man who had terrified her, and the man who had just declared to the most powerful people in America that he would burn the world down for her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough wool of his coat. "Julian," she whispered. He turned his head slowly. His grey eyes, usually so guarded and cold, were wide open, stripped of all defences. He looked like a man waking up from a long, dark dream. "I ruined your dress," he murmured, his voice hoarse. He gestured vaguely to the hem of her emerald gown, which was stained with mud and the remnants of the champagne explosion. Evelyn let out a wet, choked laugh. "My dress? Julian, you just destroyed your reputation. You assaulted a police detective. You admitted to the entire 400 that you married a pauper." "I admitted," he corrected her, leaning forward to catch her hand, "that I married a queen." He pulled her toward him. There was no space for decorum anymore. Evelyn moved from her seat to the bench beside him. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into the shelter of his side. She rested her head on his shoulder, smelling the starch of his shirt and the faint, comforting scent of sandalwood that was uniquely him. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly into her hair. "Tomorrow. The papers will be in a frenzy. The scandal will be immense. The invitations might stop coming." "Let them stop," Evelyn said, closing her eyes. "I spent my whole life worrying about invitations, Julian. I spent my life terrified of what people like Clara Belmont thought of me. Tonight, when I held that gun, I didn't care about any of them. I only cared about you. If we are outcasts, then we will be outcasts together." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Not outcasts. We will be kings. We just rewrote the rules of the game." They arrived at the fortress on Madison Avenue an hour later. Usually, the house felt cold, a museum of marble and silence. But tonight, it was ablaze with light. Every lamp was lit. Mrs. Higgins threw open the double doors before the carriage even stopped. Behind her stood the entire household staff, maids, footmen, and the cook. They didn't look terrified, they looked relieved. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne." Mrs. Higgins bustled forward, her stern face crumbling into tears. "We heard. The newsboys are already shouting it on the corners. They say Silas Vane is in chains. They say the sterling name is clean." "It is, Mrs. Higgins," Julian said, helping Evelyn down. He grimaced slightly as his bruised ribs protested the movement. "And Marcus?" Evelyn asked, breathless. "In the kitchen, ma'am," Mrs. Higgins said, wiping her eyes with her apron. "Eating a steak the size of a dinner plate. He's got a broken nose and he's covered in brick dust, but he's grinning like a fool." Evelyn let out a sigh of relief that seemed to deflate her entire posture. "Thank God." "Prepare a bath for Mrs. Thorne," Julian ordered, his voice returning to its usual command, though softer. "And bring the medical kit to the library. I have a cut that needs attending." The library was warm, the fire roaring in the hearth. This was the room where they had signed their marriage contract, a cold, sterile transaction made 3 months ago. Now, it felt like a sanctuary. Julian sat in his leather armchair, discarding his ruined jacket. Evelyn took the bowl of warm water and the iodine from the maid and dismissed her. "I can do it myself," Julian protested, reaching for the cloth. "Sit still, Julian," Evelyn scolded gently. She stood between his knees, dipping the cloth into the water. She carefully wiped the dried blood from the corner of his mouth. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. "You have a heavy right hook," Evelyn noted, cleaning the split in his lip. "Vane has a hard head," Julian countered, a ghost of a smile touching his eyes. She worked in silence for a moment, the intimacy of the act weaving a new bond between them. When she was finished, she didn't move away. She stayed there, standing between his legs, her hands resting on his broad shoulders. "Julian," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens now? The deal is done. My father's name is cleared. Your railway contracts are secure. The terms of our agreement, they have been met." Julian's face darkened. The playful light vanished from his eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded, thick document. Evelyn recognized it instantly. The marriage settlement. "I remember the clauses," Evelyn said, her throat tight. "Clause 4. Separate bedrooms. Clause 7. Dissolution of marriage possible after 1 year, if mutually agreed. Clause 10. No emotional entanglements." Julian looked at the paper. "I wrote this to protect myself. I thought love was a liability. I thought a wife was just another asset to be managed, like a coal mine or a shipping line." He looked up at her, his gaze intense enough to burn. "But you are not an asset, Evelyn. You are the fire in the engine. Without you, the whole machine is cold metal." He stood up, towering over her, and walked to the fireplace. He didn't hesitate. He tossed the thick document onto the burning logs. Evelyn gasped softly as the paper curled. The ink turned black, the seals melted, and the legal barriers between them turned to ash and smoke. "Clause 4 is struck," Julian said, watching the flames. "No more separate bedrooms. I want to wake up every morning and see you. I want to be the last thing you see before you sleep." He turned to face her, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his sharp features. "Clause 7 is void," he continued, stepping closer. "There will be no dissolution. You are stuck with me, Evelyn. Through the scandals, the fights, the boring dinners, and the quiet nights, I am never letting you go." Evelyn walked to him, tears streaming freely now. "And Clause 10? Clause 10 was a lie," Julian whispered, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. "I was entangled the moment I saw you standing in that rain, looking at me with those defiant green eyes. I just didn't know it was love. I thought it was a challenge." "I love you, Julian," Evelyn cried, burying her face in his chest. "I love you. And I love you," he vowed, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "Now, Mrs. Thorne, I believe we have a lot of lost time to make up for." 6 months later, New York City had changed. The winter slush had given way to the vibrant green of spring, but the biggest change was in the social hierarchy. The name Silas Vane was no longer spoken in polite society, except as a cautionary tale. He was currently rotting in a cell in Sing Sing prison, his fortune seized and redistributed to the victims of his embezzlement. The sterling name, however, shone brighter than ever. Evelyn stood on the steps of the newly renovated Sterling Public Library. The soot and grime of the past years had been scrubbed away, leaving the white marble gleaming in the May sunshine. A massive crowd had gathered, not just the wealthy elite, but the common people of the 5 Points, the workers from Julian's railways, and the families who had been helped by the new Sterling Thorn Foundation. Evelyn adjusted her hat. She looked radiant, her skin glowing with health, her auburn hair piled high under a silk fascinator. Nervous? Julian appeared at her elbow. He looked different, too. The hard lines of stress around his mouth had softened. He still wore the finest suits in New York, but he no longer looked like a predator scanning for threats. He looked like a man at peace. "A little," Evelyn admitted. "It's a big speech." "You stared down a gunman," Julian reminded her with a smirk. "You can handle the library board." "The gunman was easier," she teased. He didn't care about the dewy decimal system. Julian laughed, a rich, deep sound that turned the heads of several women nearby. He placed a protective hand on the small of her back. "They are ready for you," he said. Evelyn stepped up to the podium. She spoke of her father, not as the victim the papers had painted him as, but as the visionary he was. She spoke of the importance of truth and how easy it is to lose it in the noise of gossip. And she spoke of second chances. When she cut the ribbon, the applause was deafening. Marcus, standing in the front row in a suit that was straining at the seams, wiped a tear from his eye. Thomas O'Malley, holding the keys to the library he now managed, beamed with pride. As the crowd began to disperse into the building for the reception, Evelyn stayed back on the steps. Julian joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You did well," he murmured. "Your father would be proud." "He would," Evelyn agreed. She turned to her husband, her expression turning serious. "Julian, there is something I haven't told you. I wanted to wait until today, until the past was fully put to rest." Julian's brow furrowed instantly, the old protective instinct flaring up. "What is it? Is it vain? Has someone threatened you?" "No, nothing like that," she smiled, placing her hand over his, which rested on her waist. She moved his hand slowly, sliding it around to rest gently on her stomach. Julian froze. He looked at his hand, then at her face, his grey eyes widening in shock. "Evelyn," he breathed. "It seems the Sterling line is not ending, Julian," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "And neither is the Thorn line. We are going to have a baby." The Iron Baron, the man who moved mountains of steel and crushed competitors without blinking, looked as though he might faint. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He simply stared at her stomach with a look of absolute, terrifying wonder. "A baby," he choked out. "Ideally," Evelyn laughed. "Or perhaps a very small railway engineer." Julian let out a shout of laughter, pure, unadulterated joy. He didn't care who was watching. He scooped Evelyn up into his arms, spinning her around on the library steps as the crowd below cheered. "Put me down, you brute!" Evelyn laughed, clinging to his neck. "Never," Julian vowed, setting her down but keeping her close. He looked at her with a tenderness that could break a heart. "I never had a family, Evelyn. I never knew what it was to be safe, to be loved." He placed his hand back on her stomach, reverently. "I promise you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will build a world for this child. I will protect you both with everything I have." "I know," Evelyn said, leaning her forehead against his. "You already have." The sun began to set over New York, casting long golden shadows over the city they now owned, not with money, but with spirit. They stood together on the steps, no longer the beggar and the baron, but a father and a mother, looking out at a future that was wide open and completely their own. So ends the story of Evelyn and Julian, a tale that reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with guns, but with the courage to trust another person. They started as enemies in a transaction, bound by a contract of convenience, but they found something far more valuable than the sterling fortune. They found a partnership that could withstand fire, scandal, and death itself. It shows us that honor isn't about what society thinks of you. It's about standing up for the truth, even when your voice shakes. I hope this story of redemption, justice, and burning romance kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed the twist with the Shadow Ledger, or if Julian's public defense of Evelyn melted your heart, please take a moment to like this video. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this story with a friend who loves a good historical drama, and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the next epic romance.